Now, I want to dedicate at least 2 more episodes to Flexbox. Trust me, it's that important. It's the bedrock of all the CSS you'll write in 2018 and beyond. All right, so we have our header from the last episode. I now want to add a row of 4 items here, maybe 4 callout boxes for your homepage. All right, let's scroll down. Here's the header we created in the last episode, and you'll remember we added that container element, and that's what sets a maximum width and centers everything on the page. So we can reuse that down here. All right, right here, div container, hello, and if we give that a refresh, you'll see it perfectly lines up. But now we want the same amount of padding as we had up here in our header. So you'll notice here we have a padding of maybe 30 pixels, something like that. All right, well, we could reproduce that down here, but you always want to be a little careful about that. And that's because, well, if you reproduce it in 50 different places, the likelihood that you'll get it wrong or use a different value and then things won't line up properly or look as consistent, that likelihood increases. So in situations like this, it can be helpful to create a dedicated class for it. Maybe something like this. If you have a class of section, there we will apply your base padding. Okay, so now let me remove it from the header. I extracted all of the header CSS from the last episode into this file, mostly to keep today's episode nice and tidy. You don't have to do that. All right, so if we come back and give this a refresh, we've lost all of our padding, and we can manually add it back in. So here, we'll opt in and say that's our section. And then down here, let's do the same thing. Okay, so now we have the same amount of padding for all of our containers. Let's begin with our 4 boxes. So here we'll have some callout text, and we did say we want 4 of them. Okay, so if we come back and give that a refresh, this is what you'd expect, right? The default display for a div is block, so it's going to display as a block. Basic common sense. However, if we wanted to display in a row, well, let's use Flexbox. So I'm going to grab all of this and wrap it within a div, and I'm going to create a utility class here called Flex. Utility classes can be incredibly useful. They're a bit controversial, but I think you're seeing the tides change toward using them rather than away from using them. A utility class is a simple class that maybe isn't the most semantic thing in the world, but it helps you build up the styling for your components. So you might have a utility class called text center. It doesn't describe what this element is, but nonetheless, it's incredibly useful. That's a utility class. So in this case, let's come back here and we'll create one called Flex. And all that's going to do is set a display of Flex. You want your utility classes to be as minimal and basic as possible so that they can be reused anywhere. If you suddenly add a background color of red, well now, any place where you want to opt into this functionality must also opt in to a background color of red, which of course you don't want. Okay, but anyways, we've now wrapped all of those divs within a parent with a class of Flex. So now that's our way of saying every child element, every direct child element should display as a row. And there we go. Okay, so now, yeah, you could play around with this like we learned about justified content. So if we did space between, and now we're saying make the space between each of these elements the same. And again, the only way to do that is to perfectly align them as you see here. So now we could say flex div, we'll give it a background color of kind of a grayish, a height of 100 pixels. And you can see how very quickly you can start constructing your grids. Give it some padding, and you get the idea. So as it turns out, when you're creating grids like this, there's 100 different ways you could structure things. For example, rather than justify content, which is a neat trick, what you could also do here is set flex to 1. This is a new property. Don't confuse that with display of flex. Here we're saying, okay, so for all of the elements that match this selector, we want them to either shrink or grow to have a ratio of 1. So effectively, they will grow in this case to be the exact same width. And you can even have some fun with this. So for example, maybe this one alone, you want that to take up twice as much space as the other 3 here. All right, let's give that one a shot. Flex, not of 1, but 2. I want it to take up 200%. So now you'll see this takes up twice as much space as these, or 3 times as much space. So the amount of control you have here is pretty insane. It's very cool. That's why you should learn this. So let's come back. Let's get back to work. Now, let's name these. Call is fairly common. And in this case, since we do have kind of a grid wrapper, why don't we give this a class of row? Once again, this is fairly common. All right, so here we'll say flex, but also row to be a little more clear. And then we'll add another one here called column, and that will have a flex of 1. All right, so let's come back, give this all a refresh, and there you go. Now, I'd like to add some space and some background colors inside. So what you'll often do here is wrap all of this. So you have your main column, and then within it, you could add maybe a box here and paste all that in. And now your box can be styled exclusively. Now, if we bump back up to our column, there we can apply some padding. And that will give us each of these structures here, where we have some space between the two. All right, so let's keep working on this. Back to app.css, we're now going to have padding of 10 pixels all around. And then we also set up a box element. We'll steal that, like so. So come back and give that a refresh. And yeah, we have our 4-column grid. But we're not quite done yet, because on this column, we added this 10 pixels worth of padding. Let's just do it quite a bit so you can see it very clearly. Well, now, of course, your lines are all gone. We still want this guy to line up with the left edge of our container. So a common technique for this is for whatever padding you want to apply. So in this case, let's bring that back down to 10 pixels. Well, on the parent or the row, you need to apply negative margin to compensate for that. So let's give it a shot. We applied 10 pixels worth of padding. So on the left, let's do negative 10 pixels. And on the right, negative 10 pixels as well. Okay, so now you have your spacing, you have your columns, but the left edge is going to perfectly line up. And on the right edge, the same is true. That's a very common technique you'll see in CSS frameworks. So let's come back and implement this. And if we give this a refresh, that's looking pretty good to me. Okay, so now that we have the basic structure in place, it gets really, really easy. So take a look. Here we have a row of 4 items. Let's do another row, and this one will be 2 items. So we'll get rid of 2 of them. Come back, give that a refresh, and everything instantly works. And that's because at no point did we explicitly set a width. You'll see here, there's no width. We just said flex 1. Automatically, this is the great thing about Flexbox. We automatically determine the width. So if I get rid of that, of course, this is what you would normally get. As wide as possible to fit the available text, but no wider, unless you added more, in which case it will dynamically increase. Yeah, so flex 1 is what is doing this for us. So we have 4 columns, 2 columns. Let's do another one of maybe 6 columns. So we'll do it right here. We have 4. We're going to create 2 more. There you go. And then finally, let's finish out with a final one of 3 columns. So we have 1, 2. Yeah, well, once you do a little bit of work to set your grid and your row, then you're all set to go. It's really, really easy stuff. And then when you want this to be more responsive, like for mobile devices, you don't want any columns at all. Trust me, that's a cinch, and we'll definitely go over that. So to finish up, let's say these callout items, they should be centered within the container. All right, let's give that a shot. And this was just for an example. Let's bring it back to something very basic like we had originally. All right, so we want these to be vertically and horizontally centered. And this was always tricky in CSS. If you come from the 2005 days, man, you were looking it up. You were Googling for 20 minutes to figure this out. But now take a look. Yes, on the row, we have a display of flex. But in our box, we're going to do the exact same thing. Even a flexed item can also be its own flex container. All right, so let's say a display of flex. Now, you already learned about justify content to the center, so that takes care of that. The inverse of that will be align items. So align items to the center will be on, by default, the vertical axis, and the justify content will be on the horizontal axis, unless you change the direction, in which case they flip. That's a little tricky. Hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about that, but until then, just keep it in mind. Yeah, so now we added 3 properties here, and we have perfectly centered text. So you may remember in the old days, You did stuff like this where, well, if you have a height of 100 pixels, you set the line height to 100 pixels to match, and then you would do text align center, and you'd get the same thing. And that sounds great until you have something like this. So let's grab that. We'll add 3 paragraph tags here. Wrap that up. Yeah, it suddenly breaks down very quickly because now each of those is being affected by the line height and you only see one. But they're there. So if we remove that, yeah. So this is where display of flex, justify content to the center, and align items to the center solves that problem completely. And then you can set padding all around, whatever you need to do there. Maybe 10 pixels on the top and bottom and 30 on the left and right. And yeah, this stuff ends up being so much easier. Finally, in closing, if you want, in this case for the box, you could set a flex direction of column. And remember, that changes the default direction from left to right as a row to a column structure. So now, if we did something like that, you can get those in a line vertically, which might be more along the lines of what you want. But yeah, the possibilities are endless. You just got to learn it, and then you're good to go.